The RX 6700 XT launched at $480, which is only $20 less than the RTX 3070 from NVIDIA. These are the models I'm testing in this video, by the way. So this is the cheapest models available at the time I purchased. So this is the Asus Dual Gaming OC from the 3070, and I do have the AMD reference model. So if you're judging temperatures, I will say it's an advantage on the cooler on the 3070, but some 6700 XTs would have much better cooling. Anyway, but when they came out, there was only a $20 difference between these GPUs. So if you're judging your buying decision based on the launch reviews, I think you're going to get a very different result than how things actually are in the current market, because the 6700 XT has dropped way below its original MSRP. You can find the cheapest models available if I was buying today are about $360 new, and then go up a little bit from there if you want some different cooler models. Whereas if I tried to buy an RTX 3070, it's actually still hard to find at its original MSRP of $500. The cheapest model, if I was buying one today, brand new, is $530, and they go up from there. That means that the RTX 3070 isn't just a $20 extra nowadays compared to its MSRP, it's actually 47% more expensive. Now with NVIDIA GPUs especially so expensive right now, when you're buying a new GPU, you should seriously consider selling your old GPU in this current market, take advantage of the high sales prices, and help fund your new GPU purchase. And today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, is a great place to do that. They give you two options. The most convenient option is to sell directly to Jawa. You tell them your GPU model and condition. They give you a price immediately. You ship your GPU to Jawa. They receive it, inspect it, and pay you immediately. However, if you'd like more control over the price and running your own listing and are willing to do all that yourself, you can list it for sale yourself on Jawa, create your own listing and choose your price. Gamer buys your graphics card, you ship out the card within 3 business days, and you get paid 2 days after the buyer receives the GPU. Now, if you're like, wait, that just sounds like doing eBay, okay, well, they offer great seller protections like eBay does, but you get to keep more of your money. They have some of the lowest fees on the market, and they're also very gamer friendly, help pass on great gaming experiences by selling to real gamers on Jawa. So let's take a look at in some benchmarks in the latest games like Unreal Engine 5. I do have Smart Access Memory enabled and ResizeBAR enabled. However, everything else is running at their out-of-the-box settings on these GPUs. Does the RTX 3070 justify a 47% markup in the current market? Let's run the benchmarks and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. A huge number of new games are going to be using Unreal Engine 5 with its features like Lumen and Nanite and virtualized shadow maps. It looks excellent, although right now the only game we can test it out in is Fortnite, so that's why we're using Fortnite here. And I'm using the game's replay feature to play back-to-back on different GPUs and settings. First, we're looking at, can these GPUs max out an Unreal Engine 5 game at 1440p epic settings? This doesn't have the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on yet, although we will look at that. Although Lumen itself is kind of more of a software-based ray tracing system, which looks excellent. I mean, I understand this cartoony style graphics, but if you look at the lighting, this really does look quite good. However, it is extremely demanding. You can see that the RTX 3070 is averaging around 40 FPS with 1% lows around 31. The 6700 XT is matching the 1% lows around 31, although overall is a little bit slower with around a 38 FPS average at this point in the benchmark run. And that's giving the RTX 3070 an 8% lead overall. And that's actually interesting because, as you'll see later on in the benchmarks, a lot of the other in a lot of the other games, including Unreal Engine 4, RTX 3070 will have a larger lead. So it's looking like Unreal Engine 5, at least at this point and in this game, does seem to actually be a pretty good place for AMD graphics cards, and I've seen that in some of my other testing as well. Now, since neither GPU was really giving a 60 FPS experience there, I thought I'd leave it at the 1440p settings, but turn it down to high. Now, I'm not going to go below high because if you go down to the medium settings, it turns off the features like Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, which are the whole point of what we're trying to test right here. Remember, this is really about testing Unreal Engine 5 in the only game we can, rather than Fortnite specifically. Here we're actually seeing both GPUs averaging in the mid-60s, although the 6700 XT has a little bit of a lead in the 1% lows with about 56 compared to about 51. But overall, again, the average performance here is a tie. Now you'll notice if you're looking at like the temperature differences, keep in mind that my 6700 XT is the reference model, which is honestly not the greatest cooler in the world, although it does get the job done. And the RTX 3070 has an aftermarket cooler, so a little bit of an advantage there. Now, this is what happens when you turn ray tracing on at the high setting at 1440p. They move from being tied with hardware accelerated ray tracing turned off to a 10% lead for the RTX 3070, which is not massive, although and their 1% lows are actually both tied right now at 49. But the average performance, again, is favoring the 3070 a little bit here, although this is not a very heavy ray tracing implementation. So the heavier ray tracing workloads, like we'll see when I test out Cyberpunk for more thorough RT performance testing, will show a larger advantage to the NVIDIA GPU. But it is showing that both of them are able to do some hardware accelerated ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5 at high settings, but not Epic. Now, if we do want to be at the Epic preset and use hardware RT, there's just no chance at a 60 FPS experience. Although if we upscale a little bit here, so using DLSS quality on the RTX 3070, since I think that's what people would actually use, and using TSR quality, this engine should feature FSR, although this build of Fortnite doesn't. So they do have their own temporal super resolution, which I'm using at the same upscaling preset, so they're both rendering at the same internal resolution, although I do think DLSS quality does look better than TSR here. And we're seeing a 14% performance lead for the 3070. Both GPUs are pretty playable, although those probably aren't the settings I would use anyway. However, if we drop down to 1080p, we're now seeing at the Epic settings, both GPUs can get close to a 60 FPS average, but they're just not quite there, more like the mid-50s, and they're actually exactly tied. Now remember, at 1440p Epic settings, we actually saw a bit of a lead for the 3070, but this is expected behavior between these two architectures for NVIDIA and AMD on this generation. Generally, the NVIDIA GPUs scaled a little better as resolutions increased. Also, there's a bit of a lighting difference here, because I noticed the sun position wasn't consistent between benchmark runs, so that hopefully isn't throwing off the overall performance too much. But again, I'm using the replay feature, and when I did the testing, I was unaware that the sun position could change between runs. Anyway, if we decide to turn on the hardware accelerated ray tracing at 1080p Epic, we now see both GPUs falling in performance, although the 6700 XT falls further, with now a 12% lead for the RTX 3070 at these settings. Both GPUs playable, although the 3070 is averaging more in the mid-50s, and the 6700 XT averaging more in the upper 40s, although the difference in their 1% lows is a much smaller lead for the RTX 3070. So are you going to be maxing out games completely, including ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5? Even at 1080p, I think both of these GPUs will be playable, but not necessarily giving you a 60 FPS experience. Now, if you're willing to go down to the high settings, which again, we still have Lumen, we still have Nanite, we still have virtual shadow maps, just at reduced settings, we're now seeing both of these GPUs giving us a high refresh rate experience. Personally, I like the feel of 90 FPS a lot better than the feel of 60 FPS, and everything past that is good, but kind of diminishing returns. And that's what we're getting here at the 1080p high settings. And at these settings, we actually see the 6700 XT with a 10% lead over the 3070, averaging in the mid-90 FPS range, whereas the 3070 is averaging in the upper 80 FPS range. So noticeable, although not massive, lead here for the 6700 XT. And again, I think this is really encouraging sign for how AMD seems to be optimizing for at least the current builds of Unreal Engine 5, which will be huge for games moving forward. Now, because they both had a lot of headroom on their performance, at the 1080p high settings, I thought it would not be unreasonable to want to turn on the hardware accelerated RT, which again just makes the Lumen a little bit more accurate. That's really what it does. I think you get a little bit better reflections and things like that as well. And with that enabled, we see the 6700 XT drop from having a lead to actually being behind in the RTX 3070 with a 7% lead, so not massive, with about a mid-80s average versus an 80 average. The 1% lows, though, are actually better for the 6700 XT, which is interesting to note because, again, it's losing in the averages, but it's winning in the 1% lows. But let's go ahead and look at another title. I use Cyberpunk as my ray tracing benchmark, and we're going to look at a variety of settings here. Now, one thing that's important to note here is even if I didn't have ray tracing on, the 3070 has a larger lead in this game than it does in what we saw in Unreal Engine 5. I was pointing out that Unreal Engine 5 seemed to be a pretty good game for AMD here. Well, the 3070 here with ray tracing low has a 19% lead over the 6700 XT, and this is at 1080p. The ray tracing low preset in this game actually only adds in ray traced local shadows. It doesn't have reflections, it doesn't have any of the bounce lighting, it doesn't even have sun shadows. So honestly, this is not a very impressive RT implementation. Although at these settings at 1080p, the 6700 XT has its 1% lows at 58, averaging in the mid-70s, although the 3070 is doing a lot better, averaging nearly 90 FPS with 1% lows in the upper mid-60s. So definitely a better experience there. Now, I like to test out ray traced reflections as my own customized medium ray traced setting, because the actual ray tracing medium setting, which we will also look at, doesn't include ray traced reflections. And in Cyberpunk, at least, I think ray traced reflections are one of the most just visually noticeable features. And so here, you see that we're testing three things here. Well, the RTX 3070, I didn't bother test with upscaling because it performed so well without upscaling that it just didn't seem necessary. You can see it averaging over 70 FPS. Whereas the 6700 XT at native, which we see on the left-hand side, is only averaging in the upper mid-40 range with 1% lows down into the 30s. However, if you use FSR2 quality upscaling, it's able to almost match the native resolution performance of the 3070. Now, it's only fair to point out that the 3070 could have then used DLSS. Also, I don't like the look of the palm tree branches and things upscaled at 1080p here. They look noticeably blurry, but I did just want to test that out. I actually should have tested the 3070 with DLSS quality. I just didn't even think to when I was running my benchmarks because it was performing so well without it. Same thing with ray tracing medium. At 1080p with the ray tracing medium preset, we see the 3070 leading by 51%, which is a massive lead. Now, the RTX 3070 at the native 1080p resolution is averaging in the mid-50s, and easier scenes it'll get over 60. It's definitely playable, though it's not a locked 60 FPS. The 6700 XT using FSR2 at the quality setting can roughly match that performance, but then again, you do definitely lose some image quality. It is noticeably more pixelated, especially in motion and on certain objects, like the palm tree branches, things like that. And the 6700 XT, if you wanted to go for a locked 30 FPS experience, it's playable that way, although this certainly wouldn't be what I would do. Now, ray tracing medium uses the local shadows, sun shadows, and medium lighting setting with none of the reflections. If we go up to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, which includes the local shadows, the sun shadows, the reflections, and the lighting up to the Ultra setting, although it doesn't have the Psycho setting, and also I'm using the released version of the game that has not added in the RT Overdrive mode yet, which is full path tracing. So if you're watching this in the future when Cyberpunk gets its RT Overdrive update, this is not that. So this is Ray Tracing Ultra. We see the RTX 3070 pull ahead with a 70% lead, although how meaningful you feel that is based on how the 3070 is actually performing here is up to you. Some people are fine playing games in the mid-40 FPS range, which is the average that we're getting on the RTX 3070, and it looks very good at those settings, although personally, I would want to turn things down to get a higher frame rate. Whereas the 6700 XT, I just really would not recommend playing in the mid-20 FPS range just to get all of these ray tracing effects maxed out. So this is really showing that when you really push the ray tracing workloads, the advantages increase for the 3070. However, since even the 3070 was struggling a bit there, I thought we'd try some upscaling. Now, On the left, you're seeing the 6700 XT at RT Ultra with FSR2 set to the quality setting. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing the RTX 3070 with DLSS set to the quality setting. And while it's hard to see, I'm sure, in the YouTube video due to compression, I do think that DLSS quality does look noticeably better than FSR2 quality when you're doing 1080p upscaling. At the higher resolutions, it's still better, but it's less noticeable. But the lower the resolution, I think the more DLSS has an image quality advantage. Now, at those quality upscaling settings, the RTX 3070 also has a performance advantage of 60% here, trying to run Ray Tracing Ultra, and it's actually, the 3070 is averaging in the mid-70s. In the middle, you're seeing the 6700 XT trying out FSR2 at the performance setting just to see if we could try to average around 60 FPS. We can, but it looks very blurry, and I wouldn't recommend doing it. But let's go ahead and say, okay, we looked at the major advantage of NVIDIA, which is the ray tracing performance. Now what if we look at a game where AMD tends to have a bit of an advantage, which is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. And I'm looking at this at 1080p balanced preset. I'm not using the extreme preset because as a competitive multiplayer game, I think the typical user would be most likely to actually be turning settings down a bit in order to get a competitive edge. And here we're seeing the 6700 XT with an 11% lead in frames per second, although both GPUs, to be fair, are giving a very good experience at 1080p balanced preset. So both of them looking very good. Definitely a bit of a win here for AMD, though, at the 11% lead. Now, even the 1% lows are over 100 FPS on both GPUs, so looking very solid, which means we probably have some headroom for 1440p. So let's take a look at that. So at 1440p balanced settings, we see the 6700 XT with a 10% lead, so still very good. And both GPUs actually still delivering around 100 FPS or a little more on the RTX 3070, closer to 120 FPS average on the 6700 XT. The 1% lows, which are very important in a competitive shooter, we're looking at kind of the lower 80s on the 3070 and the upper 80s on the 6700 XT. So not a mind-blowing difference or anything like this, but definitely a lead for the AMD GPU in this particular game. And as I'll talk about more in the wrap-up, considering it costs so much less, and I know some people who play competitive games really just focus on one competitive game, and that's almost all you do on your PC. So if you're just playing Call of Duty all day, well, this the AMD GPU here costs a lot less and is giving a performance advantage. Now, let's look at A Plague Tale Requiem. This game is a PS5 and Xbox Series console generation exclusive. It doesn't look at backwards compatibility on the older consoles. It's also an NVIDIA-sponsored title, so I will mention that. But here we're getting the 3070 with a 24% lead at 1080p Ultra. This game looks great. Honestly, this cutscene doesn't show it off as well as it could because I think it's really the environments and the lighting that are incredibly impressive in this game. The face animations and things like that are, I think, actually one of the weakest parts of the game, but I think this is one of the best looking games ever made. And this is not an Unreal Engine game. This is a in-house engine from Asobo Studios. Looks great. 37 coming in with a 24% lead at 1080p Ultra, but both GPUs giving a pretty playable experience. However, if we jump up to 1440p Ultra, we see both GPUs more frequently dipping below 60 FPS. So just keep in mind, although in this particular game, consoles are targeting more like the 30 FPS cap, even on like a PS5, although I think you might be able to go into 120 hertz container with a 40 FPS output or something like that. But the point is, this is a demanding game even on something like a PS5. So you could play it below 60 FPS and it'll honestly work just fine. The RTX 3070 has a 20% lead at 1440p Ultra. And both GPUs, like I said, enabling a playable experience. You could turn down the settings a bit, use some upscaling, something like that if you really wanted to lock into 60 FPS. The 6700 XT averaging more like 50 and the 3070 closer to 60. Now, speaking of a PS5 exclusive game, Returnal was a PS5 exclusive on consoles. And it uses I think a pretty customized version of the Unreal Engine 4. And here in Unreal Engine 4 at the 1080p epic settings, we're seeing a 9% lead for the RTX 3070. So not as big of a lead as we saw in Plague Tale Requiem. But this game does have some ray tracing features, which I really, this video is going to be long enough on the benchmarks already, so I was really using the Unreal Engine 5 for light ray tracing workloads and Cyberpunk for the heavy ray tracing workloads. The other games we're going to stick more just to the rasterized performance. And here we're seeing, like I said, 9% lead for the 3070, but both GPUs delivering an excellent experience at 1080p epic. Here at 1440p epic, both GPUs are still delivering a very good experience. The RTX 3070 has slightly increased its lead to 11%. And in this game, another thing that I think is a little bit interesting is I feel like, I should actually double check this. So I do have ResizeBAR and Smart Access Memory enabled, but NVIDIA does it on a whitelist. So unless you want to manually change it through a third-party app, NVIDIA only whitelists certain games. I'm wondering if this game is benefiting from Smart Access Memory, because you can see the VRAM usage is a little bit higher on the 6700 XT, and I think sometimes that happens. Sometimes I spot that in games that are actually benefiting from the Smart Access Memory feature. Anyway, both GPUs with good average performance here in a PS5 exclusive game, 1440p epic settings. Now, how about the Callisto Protocol? This is an Unreal Engine 4 game that's actually an AMD-sponsored title. However, it's giving the RTX 3070 the largest lead, at least when we're not enabled ray tracing, that we've seen so far, with a 36% lead over the 6700 XT at the 1080p epic settings. Now, both GPUs have decent averages here, and both of them have terrible 1% lows, but every GPU has bad 1% lows in the Callisto Protocol benchmark. This game is all over the place on the frame times, and that just is what it is. Now, that being said, it is one of the best-looking Unreal Engine 4 games that I've ever seen. And if we increase it to 1440p epic settings, we're now seeing a 33% lead for the RTX 3070 over the 6700 XT. And both GPUs during this incredibly demanding corridor sequence are dipping very low on the frame rates. However, many of the other scenes in the game are a lot easier to handle. But once again, definitely showing a pretty large performance lead for the RTX 3070 in this title, and that is something that's fairly typical to see in a lot of Unreal Engine 4 games, which is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the fact that we're not seeing this kind of a massive lead, at least so far in Unreal Engine 5, at least with Fortnite. Now, jumping into a non-Unreal Engine game, let's take a look at Forza Horizon 5. And at the 1080p extreme settings here, we're seeing a 12% lead for the RTX 3070. Now, this game, when it launched, was actually a game where the 6700 XT was faster than a 3070 because of Smart Access Memory support, where they got a large boost from Smart Access Memory. However, in a patch, I think around October of last year, NVIDIA actually whitelisted this game for ResizeBAR. And since they've done that, NVIDIA has pulled back into a bit of a lead in this game. We're seeing a 12% lead here, which is pretty good. If we bump up to 1440p at the extreme settings, we are seeing a 16% lead for the RTX 3070. Now, I will mention that this game tries to use a lot of VRAM, so while it doesn't have too big of an issue in the benchmark run, although occasionally I'll see a little frame time spike, on the 3070. I'm not sure this portion of the benchmark run, I'm not showing you the full thing in this video, shows any of them. But actually playing the game on 8GB GPUs at the extreme settings, I do occasionally notice a bit of a VRAM spillover, which is something I'll talk about more in the closing section of this video of, hey, the 3070 is faster, but the 6700 XT does have 12 gigabytes of VRAM versus 8, so certainly something to consider. Now, Atomic Heart is one of the newest Unreal Engine 4 games, and we're seeing the RTX 3070 with a 15% lead. Again, this is an Unreal Engine 4 title, and this is at the 1080p atomic settings, which are the maximum settings. This game does not feature any ray tracing, although it had demoed ray tracing prior to launch. They just randomly decided to launch without any ray tracing support. Maybe it'll get patched in later, something like that. Anyway, both GPUs doing well here. This game actually looks quite good and does perform quite well given what it looks like. Seems fairly optimized. Jumping up to 1440p at the atomic preset, we're seeing the 3070 with an 18% lead. We see the 6700 XT averaging right at about 60 FPS, and the RTX 3070 up into the lower 70 FPS range in the averages for this game. So now the game itself, I don't know, the voice acting, maybe it's not the voice acting, I don't know, maybe it's the writing. I don't know, if you want a Duke Nukem style character, maybe, I don't know. I might get back to playing this one, but I switched over to some other games after this one came out. Looks very good and seems pretty well optimized though. Let's get some final thoughts. So we watched the benchmarks. Does the RTX 3070 justify a 47% price increase over the RX 6700 XT? Well, no. Okay. Let me put it this way. Do I think that the RTX 3070 should cost more than a 6700 XT? Yes. If you look at the benchmarks, there were a few cases where the 6700 XT was as fast, and even fewer where it was faster than the 3070. The only real advantage the 6700 XT has is 12 gigabytes of memory over 8 gigabytes of memory, which in the particular set of games, although they are all new demanding games that I chose to test out in this video, none of them really were seeing a lot of issues with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. There are some other games that have come out extremely recently where we are seeing a bit more of a problem. We've seen 8 gigabyte GPUs, like I tested my 3070 Ti in Resident Evil 4 with ray tracing enabled and it was crashing, although if you turn off RT, things get a lot more under control. Hogwarts Legacy, I saw some stuttering with VRAM spillover on my 8 gigabyte 3060 Ti when I was testing it, and other channels have seen some issues in that game as well. And we're also seeing games like The Last of Us Part 1 with its PC remake taking huge amounts of VRAM as well. I believe Hardware Unboxed did a pretty thorough testing of that and saw a lot of VRAM spillover in that game. Now, you can definitely get the 8 gigabytes under control, especially at 1080p by turning down some settings, although that is a bit frustrating to do. However, that being said, I do think that because the 3070 was noticeably faster in most situations, as well as NVIDIA having better support in a lot of productivity applications, although not all of them. Look at your particular workflow. I do think DLSS 2 looks a little bit better than FSR 2, especially at lower resolutions or more aggressive settings. Things like that. I do think if someone just offered me these two GPUs at the same price, or let's go with their MSRPs, pay 20 bucks more for the 3070, I think I would. I think I would pay 20 bucks more for the 3070. However, if the 6700 XT actually in the current market, if I sort prices low to high right now on PC Part Picker, this is live, not some cherry-picked result, $360 versus the RTX 3070 at $530, I would absolutely pick the 6700 XT from a value proposition, hands down, any day of the week. But what that really means is that these GPUs don't really compete against each other in the current market. It's not really, is the 3070 worth 47% more? That's not really the question you need to ask yourself. The question is, what price point are you buying at? If you're buying in the $350 price bracket, then the 6700 XT is an option and the 3070 isn't. What's an option from NVIDIA in the $350 price point? The RTX 3060 is the NVIDIA competitor around $340 to $350. And against the 3060, which I've already tested out, feel free to watch that full video, the 6700 XT, in my opinion, crushes the 3060. Now, against the 3060 Ti, it's a much closer call between the two GPUs in overall performance, although the 6700 XT does have the 12 gigabytes of VRAM versus 8, and the 3060 Ti actually still does cost noticeably more than a 6700 XT at $410 to $420. So really, if you're buying a GPU at the $350 price point, you're just not considering the RTX 3070. If you're buying the RTX 3070 new, you're looking at over $500, in which case the AMD competition would be an RX 6800, which actually still comes in cheaper than the RTX 3070, and it has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and it's noticeably faster than the RTX 3070 in most situations, even some lighter ray tracing workloads, although in heavier ray tracing workloads, the 3070 does have a bit of an advantage. And you can watch my full video comparing the RX 6800 against the RTX 3070 because, again, they are closer price competitors. Now, why did I look at the 6700 XT versus the RTX 3070? Because when I compared the 6800 against the 3070, a lot of people were like, well, it should compete with the 6700 XT. Do that video. And when I compared the 6700 XT against the 3060 and 3060 Ti, some people were like, well, you got to compare it against the 3070. That's what it's designed to compete against. Well, at MSRP, at launch, yes, the 6700 XT does look like it was designed to compete against the 3070, but in the current market, they just aren't in the same price bracket, so I really don't think they're actually direct competitors. The 3070 does seem like the better GPU at absolutely everything except for VRAM, basically. Now, one interesting thing to note was that in Unreal Engine 5, it did seem like the performance difference was not massive between the two GPUs compared to what we were seeing in like Unreal Engine 4, for example. So maybe that points to better optimization for AMD GPUs in Unreal Engine 5 versus what we saw in Unreal Engine 4. Hard to say. It's interesting stuff. But overall, I would say, yeah, the 3070 is a better GPU other than the VRAM, but should it cost, is it worth 47% more? I really don't think so. And I think if you're spending that much more, you should be considering something like the RX 6800, or just if you want to buy NVIDIA, I think you should wait a couple of weeks because we're expecting to get the RTX 4070, and the rumored pricing on that is $599. We'll see if it's really available at that point. We'll see if the rumors are even true. But I think that could be disruptive to this $500 to $500 to $600 price point GPU market in the near future. What do you guys think in the comment section? Let me know, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.